Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jerry Baliles, Director of the Miller Center, and I'd like to thank all of you for being here today for this annual Ambassador William C. Battle Symposium on American Diplomacy. The topic for this symposium this year is state building in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think you will find these two sessions remarkable in terms of the depth of experience and the insights of the distinguished individuals who make up this panel discussion today. Before we get started, let me make a very important comment. As some of you know, this symposium is inspired by and made possible by the endowed support of two longtime friends of mine and distinguished and steadfast supporters of the Miller Center itself, Bill and Barry Battle. I might say that we miss Bill Battle on this 6th annual occasion of the symposium that bears his name. But as many of you know, Bill's accomplished career especially distinguished itself in the diplomatic arena. He was a Charlottesville native, the son of a former governor, a recipient of a Silver Star for his distinguished service in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He was in the same squadron in the South Pacific as John F. Kennedy, and he participated in the rescue of then John F. Kennedy when he and his crew were marooned in the Solomon Islands. After the war, Bill earned his law degree here at the university's law school. He joined the family firm of Perkins, Battle, and Minor, later to become McGuire Woods, one of the largest law firms in the southern United States. He played a key role in John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign, serving as his campaign manager in Virginia and as coordinator for all of the southeastern states. President Kennedy appointed Bill Battle as ambassador to Australia, where he served from 1962 to 1964. He worked on William B. Spong's successful senatorial campaign in 1966 before mounting his own campaign for governor, becoming the Democratic nominee in a race that ultimately was won by another good friend of the Miller Center's and mine, Linwood Holton. Bill was president and CEO of Fieldcrest Mills. He was chairman of an important research organization known as the W. Alton Jones Cell Science Center, and was also chair of a major philanthropic entity, the Ivy Foundation. Bill served on several corporate boards, was a member of the State Council of Higher Education and the University of Virginia Board of Visitors. I think he appointed him to one of those two organizations. And he was also president of the U.S. Golf Association. Bill and Barry were married for 55 long and happy years and had 3 children and 6 grandchildren. For more than 25 years, or 24 years, I suspect it was, Barry has been an advocate and a philanthropist for quality medical care in the Commonwealth. And she has been a driving force for the UVA Children's Hospital, where the Battle building bearing her name and that of Bill's is now under construction, due to be completed next May. This comprehensive outpatient facility will be an extraordinary resource to our community and indeed to children from all over Virginia. We're so pleased to host this annual Battle Symposium in recognition of the important and distinguished service of both Bill Battle and Barry. And I'd like to ask Barry to please stand and be recognized. Thank you, Barry, for being here today, for being an important part of the Miller Center's life and programming. We're grateful to you and to Bill for the endowed support of this important annual conference. So, with that, I'll turn things over now to Will Hitchcock, the director of our Research and Scholarship Program here at the Miller Center, to introduce our program.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Center and to this extraordinary session on state building in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's great to see you all here. You're in for a treat. I'm Will Hitchcock. I'm the Director of Research and Scholarship here at the Miller Center, and I'm also a Professor of History at UVA. Today's session on state building in Iraq and Afghanistan is an example of the kind of work the Miller Center does throughout the year. Our mission is to apply the lessons of history to contemporary policy problems. That's what we do. We believe that if we fail to pay careful attention to the lessons of the past, we will not be very well prepared or well equipped to chart our nation's future course. Of course, I say that since I'm a history professor, but I also happen to believe it to be true. The past doesn't give us all the answers to the big policy questions that we face, but it can provide us with insight and with understanding, and I think most importantly, a sense that we're part of a continuum. Many of the big challenges that our nation faces, we've faced in some way, shape, or form before. Others in the past have tried to grapple with these big problems, and others before them have faced equally significant problems. And I think it helps us to know that we're part of a continuum. Understanding how previous generations of Americans and their leaders dealt with the great issues that they faced can sometimes give us guidance, sometimes inspiration. Perhaps most useful, sometimes it can give us a cautionary tale about things not to do, how not to handle certain crises. Now, it seems right and fitting, I think, that on November 11, Veterans Day, we should be spending a few hours contemplating the place of war in our nation's history. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan share this one basic element with all the wars we've fought in the past. Young Americans gave their lives in battle, serving their country. And I know we'll all want to keep that terrible cost of war foremost in our minds this afternoon. Now, in our symposium today, we're going to be looking back at the very recent past. Indeed, it's so recent that it's still unfolding, and we're still in some ways living it. The topic we're going to dissect concerns our ongoing efforts to construct stable, independent, and reasonably democratic states in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, for the past decade, the U.S. has been engaged in this massive and costly and often frustrating exercise. And as Ambassador Crocker has reminded us, we don't really know yet if we have succeeded or failed. But people like the people here today have been working really hard at it. And there's now a decade's worth of work that we can examine to draw some tentative conclusions. And that's what our panelists are going to do today. We have an extraordinary group of public servants here to help us do this. Their biographies are in the program that you have, and it would use up too much time for me to go through each of them. I hope you'll look at their biographies because you'll see that these men and women are among the most deeply experienced and well-informed officials when it comes to U.S. policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's an absolute privilege to have them all here today. We're going to hold two sessions this afternoon, one on each theater of conflict. And both of these sessions will be presided over by the Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center, Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ambassador Crocker is well known to us at the Miller Center. His time here this calendar year has been thrilling, it's been enriching, it's been illuminating, and we've just been extraordinarily grateful to him for coming here this year. Frankly, there's nothing he does not know about American policy in the Middle East. And the reason that he knows so much is because he's been giving the very tall order of implementing that policy over these many years. He's been ambassador to Lebanon, Kuwait, Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. All the easy jobs. He also serves as dean and executive professor at the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. And he holds the Edward and Howard Cruz Endowed Chair there. Ambassador Crocker has had an astonishing and storied career. He's received many of the highest awards and honors a public servant can be given. I won't summarize them for you now, but I would feel remiss if I did not mention that he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian award, in 2009. Ambassador Crocker is going to moderate our two panels, and he'll keep the questions coming for our panelists. Our first panel is going to feature some introductory remarks by Stuart Bowen, who served as the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction from 2004 to 2013. His office provided oversight of the more than $60 billion of funds spent on Iraq relief and reconstruction. The reports from his office, available online and available in a very handsome print volume as well, provide exceptionally well-crafted and careful summaries of how reconstruction monies were spent, how our reconstruction effort there actually developed over time, and where we fell short in fulfilling our objectives. And I must say, as a Special Inspector General, he's not afraid to point out where we have failed to meet our objectives. Now, after he makes some general introductory remarks about his work, we'll ask the panelists, Dr. Seth Center and Professor James Savage, to make a few observations of their own, to respond to Mr. Bowen, and to throw out a few questions to him and to the panel. We'll run for about 70 minutes or so, and then we want to take your questions. And at 3 o'clock, we'll take a short break before we resume for the second panel. So without further ado, let me begin by turning things over to Stuart Bowen.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Governor Baliles, for having this panel and for having me down here. And it's an honor and a privilege and a blessing to be next to my friend, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, someone who I came to know in 2007, when against all odds, perhaps, almost, he teamed with David Petraeus to bring us back from the brink. So I'm happy to thank you publicly for that. I've thanked you privately, and also to thank you for being supportive of my oversight work in Iraq. I want to talk briefly in my introductory remarks. Excuse me, I'm also glad to be here with Seth and Jim as well.
What are you,
Seth, who I just met, and Jim, who I've worked with in the past. So, pardon my oversight. The other oversight. And now, on to the substance. 3 dates, 7 lessons for you to think about as we dig into this important topic. But let me first say, why is it important? It's important because stabilization and reconstruction operations are the place where our national security interests are going to be defended in the 21st century. They have been the place where our national security interests have been at stake since 1980. We've been in these kinds of operations one way or another pretty much continuously since 1980. Iraq and Afghanistan off the charts, of course, but we're on the cusp of another, perhaps in Syria. But are Yemen and Somalia very far behind? What about Libya and Pakistan? These are real challenges. And so I'll start with the overhead overview remark that we are not substantially better off than we were 10 years ago in being ready to carry out a mission in any of those places, or who knows where else, because we haven't learned our most important lessons from the Iraq experience, which I will go into in a moment. But 3 dates to help you get a sense of why Iraq became the program that it was. March 10th, the Situation Room, President Bush, chairing a meeting of the National Security Council, makes an important decision. He decides that we are going to liberate and leave. We're going to go in, we're going to take out Saddam Hussein. We're not going to spend very much money. You remember Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz's testimony the following month in front of the Congress that we wouldn't be paying for the reconstruction program. And the president says we're not going to disband the Army. We're going to use them as a rebuilding force. He says he makes a decision, he accepts a decision represented by the Pentagon to do a relatively shallow debathification, which by that I mean the elimination of Saddamists from the government. And he agrees with the recommendation that we will pull our troops out in September. None of that happens. April 7th, Firdas Square, Baghdad, Iraq. U.S. troops with Iraqi help pull down the statue of Saddam Hussein. General Jay Garner arrives in Baghdad that day. Part of the Organization for the Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance for Iraq. Ambassador Robin Rafel here today, who's on the second panel, was part of his team, and she also served with me at SIGIR as my Deputy Inspector General. So thanks for your service on all fronts across Iraq and now in Afghanistan and Pakistan. What happened that day was momentous but misleading. Momentous in that Saddam's edifice was thrown into the ditch, but misleading because the seeds of decay, chaos, destruction for that matter, were germinating within a chaotic Iraq. May 4th, the White House, in the small dining area next to the Oval Office, Ambassador Jerry Bremer has lunch with President Bush. And as he told me in an interview that I later had with Jerry Bremer, he said before that lunch, the president had been for a short stay in Iraq, but after that lunch, it became clear that he was for an occupation and a significant rebuilding effort. So look, from March 10th, a decision from Liberate and Leave, to May 4th, not a lot of time. We shifted our policy from Liberate and Leave to Occupy and Rebuild. Changing your policy in the face of chaos is not absurd or even unexpected, but switch to something you can do. Be sure that Plan B is executable. And the reality was, there were a number of people there who were observing this change, including Ambassador Crocker, who was part of that team, and who prophetically, as he pointed out in a memo entitled "The Perfect Storm," anticipated what was to come. And you know what came next. I made my first trip to Iraq 9 months later in February of, 10 months later in February 2004. And made 35 trips in toto. But walking the halls of the Republican Palace, that first trip, February, 2 people walking in front of me, I heard one lean over to the other and say, "We can't do that anymore, there's a new Inspector General here." That's when I knew I needed to hire auditors and investigators fast. And I did. And as you heard in the introduction, we're busy for 9.5 years, producing 390 audits and inspections, obtaining over 90 convictions, and producing 9 lessons learned reports, of which learning from Iraq is the last. And now to the 7 lessons. This is the most important lesson. The other 6 are good, but the number 1 lesson is this. We've got to reform our approach to stabilization and reconstruction operations by implementing a reform that obtains an integrated capacity to plan, execute, and oversee these kinds of operations. Right now, the duties and responsibilities for these missions are scattered chiefly among 5 agencies. The Department of State has the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, now a year old, succeeding the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, which was dissolved because it wasn't able to succeed. Its former head, John Herbst, supports this particular lesson. Ambassador John Herbst. Second, at the U.S. Agency for International Development, you have the Office of Transition Initiatives. Been around since 1994, but isn't this mission. It does what it does well, which are small-scale missions. At the Department of Treasury, you have the Office of Technical Assistance. Somewhat of a success in Iraq, frankly, but again, not part of this mission. Again, stratifying the responsibilities, diffusing them across these agencies. At Justice, you have ICITAP, trains prosecutors and judges, but again, only a slice of this mission. At the Defense Department, you have the Civilian Expeditionary Workforce, an outgrowth of the most significant evolution in military doctrine in recent times, and that is DoD Directive 3000.05, which established stabilization operations as an Army mission. This is all scattered around. We've got to reform it by creating a single agency, which I propose in Chapter 6 of Learning from Iraq as the U.S. Office for Contingency Operations. Briefly, the other 7 lessons, you'll wonder why this is a lesson. Don't carry out significant rebuilding programs in combat zones. Duh. Why is it a lesson? Because we tried to do that. The Fallujah wastewater treatment plant, we spent 8 years rebuilding and lost many people. The Basra Children's Hospital, 27 people killed, Iraqis and third country nationals in a most dangerous part of Basra. Don't do that. It is unwise and costly, and it breaks the mission down. Third, ensure full host country engagement. Chapter 2 of this report contains 44 interviews, 17 of which are with Iraqi leaders. All of them essentially told me the same thing: you didn't consult enough with us. You went forward with your plan. And Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns said to me in his interview, "Yeah, you're right. In 2003, we went in to try to do it all and do it our own way." Lesson learned. 4, establish uniform contracting, personnel, and information management systems, among others. This is a part of what we've uncovered in our lessons learned regime, is the lack of uniformity among these agencies I listed at the beginning. And without uniformity, you have disintegration, not integration. And with disintegration, you lose your center of gravity and then begin to lose the mission. Require robust oversight. Lesson learned from Iraq. People take advantage of chaotic situations, commit crimes, abuse their trust. They have to be held to account. 6th, preserve and refine programs that worked. And there were things that worked in Iraq. The Provincial Reconstruction Team program, when properly led, when well-resourced, succeeded across Iraq, and it ought to be a system that's developed further and applied in future operations as needed. The Commander's Emergency Response Program, when managed as it should have been, keep the project costs low, worked. Thousands and thousands of micro-grants to Iraqis all over the country enabled small businesses to start. And finally, plan in advance, plan comprehensively, and plan in an integrated fashion. That's self-evident and obvious, but we didn't have that in Iraq. And ultimately, how do you grasp all these other 6? How do we achieve them? I think it's captured in lesson 1. Reform our approach to the stabilization and reconstruction operations. So that's my piece. Thank you for your patience listening, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Stuart?
First of all, I thank you for being here. It's a great privilege and honor to be here with these wonderful civil servants who we all owe a debt of gratitude to. My reaction to Mr. Bowen's work and also his great publications, learning from Iraq and so on, is what do we really learn from history? And perhaps more specifically, what does the United States government learn from history? And I mean that in total, the military, the civilian agencies, and elected officials. On Veterans Day, we know we have been through many conflicts. We have engaged in reconstruction activities in the past. And the willingness of our government to learn from the past is rather limited. And so those of you who have gone through the Vietnam experience one way or the other know that we went through a counterinsurgency guerrilla war, which was lost and forgotten. We went through a reconstruction phase, or at least a stabilization phase, which was lost and forgotten. And I see in my own contact with government officials a desire to forget Iraq and Afghanistan. And for example, the State Department issued in 2010 a quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, a QDDR, and an analysis of what has taken place in general, how they should approach the future. And there's a quote in there that says, Iraq and Afghanistan are not the primary models for building our own civilian capacity to crisis and conflict. It's not just that they shouldn't be recreating Iraq and Afghanistan, it's that they don't want it to happen again. And that is the reaction again in the agency that Mr. Bowen mentioned. The Office of Coordination for Reconstruction and Stabilization was created in 2004, which was renamed the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, so you have neither coordination nor reconstruction. Now, one issue here is, what is the obligation of this country to engage in reconstruction after we intervene in a foreign situation? If we depose a leadership of a foreign government, for whatever reason, What are our obligations to stabilize and reconstruct that state, to prevent the onset of a failed state, a failing state, a dysfunctional state, perhaps something that is going on in Libya, for example. There's legislation in Congress right now calling for the creation of an Office of Contingency Operations. And this would solve some of the problems that Mr. Bowen was describing. And there's part of this legislation says, based on recent history, the United States will likely continue to find its involvement necessary in stabilization and reconstruction operations in foreign countries in the wake of violence. So will likely continue to find its involvement necessary to engage in these kind of activities. Is in fact that the case? And that is a foreign policy decision. Do you go into a country like Libya or perhaps Syria and depose its leadership? And if so, what are your obligations as a nation in the future? If in fact you're going to engage in some sort of reconstruction activity, then it is very important to do some of the recommendations, follow through some of the recommendations that Mr. Bowen has suggested, because our experience in Iraq and Afghanistan suggests stovepiping throughout the government, differences of interest between contractors. And do we have a new kind of war in Iraq and Afghanistan because of this reliance, this heavy reliance on contractors that we have not had in the past, which creates its own set of problems? And so these problems are outlined in great detail in the various publications. But if we are going to engage in that reconstruction activity, we do need to address them. But that is a serious foreign policy discussion that really needs to take place before any of those activities we get involved in. I think that there are a number of important questions to consider. Is state building and nation building and reconstruction and stabilization a necessary condition of our interventions? That's the overarching question. What is the relationship between contractors and the central government? What is the relationship between the different agencies and the stovepiping? Because my own conversations with Mr. Crocker, Ambassador Crocker in the past, and his efforts while he was ambassador in Iraq to create some sort of coordination between the various actors. How does that take place? These seem to be endemic problems, and I would in particular like to hear from Mr. Bowen and Mr. Crocker about how receptive the federal government has been from all the different agencies and all the political actors to the suggestions, and in fact, is our government capable of learning from the past?
Ambassador Crocker gave me a very strict mandate at lunch as a historian that I am not policy prescriptive, I'm policy relevant as a historian. So I will not be prescribing anything to anyone, nor should most historians, I think. First of all, I think I'm the only person on payroll here, which means I have to give a disclaimer. My views are my own. They don't represent the views of the government or the State Department, although I think fortunately we don't have official historical views in the United States anyway. First of all, let me thank the Miller Center. I was a fellow here. I was a graduate student who worked for very little money here, and it sustained me. It sustained me for a long time in graduate school, so thank you, Governor Beliles and my other friends at the Miller Center, for everything you did for me in the past. One thing I'm qualified to speak on as the State Department historian is the fact that I think Ambassador Crocker will go down as one of the great diplomatic operators in the history of the Foreign Service. This will be a long hagiography. And to address Mr. Bowen's question of the extent to which the government is committed to learning lessons and to changing. In 2009, the State Department inaugurated a new award, the Ryan Crocker Award for Excellence in Expeditionary Diplomacy, which was a signal that the State Department values the new kind of diplomacy that was undertaken by the Foreign Service in Iraq. And Ambassador Crocker subsequently has been a tireless advocate for rethinking the role of the diplomat and diplomacy in state-building environments. I believe when the award was inaugurated, that was 2009, you were retiring. Correct. And then he went to Afghanistan. Usually you take your nice fellowship at a university. You don't go to Afghanistan after an award is named after you. So it's a great tribute to a great public servant. Secretary Clinton, when she inaugurated this award in 2009, said we need to learn the lessons that were painfully taught to us in Iraq. And Stuart Bowen, more than any other American, has committed his organization to doing that. The products that they've produced are astounding. They have served as manuals, booklets, and lessons throughout the experience as they've come out. These have not just been historical documents looking backwards. Between 2009 and today, I don't think you could go to a single serious person interested in stability operations and not see his study hard lessons on their bookshelf. He's done an incredible job, incredible job. He and I were talking beforehand that the only analog might be the Truman Committee during the Second World War, which is tasked with ferreting out waste, fraud, and abuse. And I found a quote from Time magazine describing that organization from Harry Truman as a watchdog, a spotlight, a conscience, and a spark plug to the economic war behind the lines. I think those traits apply to you, except you were doing it at the front lines and sometimes beyond the front lines, which is extraordinary. I just want to offer about three or four points on the basis of my reading of your report in the context of some of my broader historical knowledge of what's happened in Iraq. So this won't totally be a celebration of the two of you gentlemen. The Singer final report set out to answer what Mr. Bowen said was a deceptively facile question. What happened to the billions spent and to what effect? And if you read the report not particularly closely, you will find out that their conclusion was no reliably complete information existed showing what U.S. reconstruction funds accomplished. The answer will be forever incomplete. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. And so knowing that the record is incomplete and merely obtaining facts was one of the great challenges for Mr. Bowen's organization, we get a problem of contested narratives, contested lessons. Immediately reading through some of the anecdotal evidence provided by the people that Mr. Bowen has interviewed, you can see, for instance, from the Iraqi perspective, the sense is you could go to any city, any town in Iraq and not see evidence of the reconstruction effort of this $52 billion the United States spent. On the other hand, quotes from American officials tend to be quite different. General Petraeus in Mr. Bowen's report said the reconstruction effort was a colossal success. It had brought colossal benefits to the Iraqi people. And so reconciling these two perceptions, I think, is pretty important at the highest level. The question then of uncontested facts, but contested meaning. We learned, for instance, that 87% of the $52 billion expended came from the Department of Defense, with the rest coming roughly 2/3, 1/3 from USAID and state. Mr. Bowen was unequivocal in advancing a new agenda, a new reformist agenda for how to resolve the issue of stability and reconstruction operations through a new organization. But it's not clear that everyone agrees that that is the signal lesson from this information. Dov Zakheim, the comptroller of the Department of Defense, and deeply involved in these issues as well in both Afghanistan and Iraq, concluded and was cited in Mr. Bowen's work as saying, quote, "Let the civilian agencies do the projects. The military is a limited reconstruction partner." So there's an astounding disconnect between different lessons derived from the same pieces of information, and I hope someone here can clarify to me who's right. More specifically, genuine buy-in. This was a lesson that Ambassador Crocker, Mr. Bowen, hammered home in this report. You need genuine buy-in from host nation partners. More than a head nod, Ambassador Crocker said. I wonder, in an environment in which we are required to expend vast sums of money in a place where where we value the national security interest, if, in fact, genuine buy-in on the front end is even possible in many situations. In other words, one of the reasons we're there willing to spend the money we're willing to spend is because there is a frail or weak government, which means that you won't know ahead of time whether or not there will be buy-in the back end as the project runs through its course in 2 or 3 years. When you take that in conjunction with the corollary lessons, you need security before you begin reconstruction, and you would like a project that is sustainable, and you start to map out a Venn diagram of a project in a dangerous environment which is secure, sustainable. You begin to wonder if any reconstruction project should ever be undertaken at all in these kinds of environments. And so I wonder where the positive lessons are, where we should insert ourselves in a productive way. And let me just close with one more point, and that is on the diplomacy of state building. The report is very much focused on large projects, where the money went, how it's expended. One thing that's not talked about directly, and that's not through any fault of Mr. Bowens, it's simply the reality of his mandate, was that throughout the Iraq War, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of engagements between diplomats, soldiers, and their Iraqi partners at all levels. From the president and the prime minister on video conferences during the Bush administration to Ambassador Crocker with his partners, all the way down to the tactical level, the brigade level. And there had to have been, I would imagine, some effect from these tens of thousands of hours of engagement between Americans and their partners. I don't know how to measure it, but the mentoring, the cajoling, simply the relationship building as an act of state building, beyond simply the expenditure of money, must have had a positive effect. And so I wonder, maybe Ambassador Crocker is the best person to answer this, how we can think about the diplomacy of state building in addition to the expenditure of funds in reconstruction in state building. And with that, I think I'll hand it back over to Ambassador Crocker.
Well, thank you all for some illuminating and occasionally provocative remarks. That's what we want here. Governor Belials, thank you for giving us this opportunity to address a very important subject, which, as Stuart Bowen says, is going to come at us again and again and again. I'm particularly honored to be part of a symposium endowed by and named for Bill Battle, one of America's greats in a number of fields that you laid out. So thank you. As we all know, today is Veterans Day, and I would just like to ask veterans in the room to stand. Thank you for your service. Not all veterans wore the uniform. And I would like to recognize my colleagues who went to hard and dangerous places and did hard things. Ambassador Robin Rafel, Iraq, Pakistan, now again, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ambassador Ariano, Iraq, Afghanistan. Stuart Bowen, Iraq. Elizabeth Field, Afghanistan. Your nation should be every bit as proud of you as they are of those who did their duty in the military services. I thank you. Several questions come immediately to mind. Stuart, I wonder if I could ask you to flesh out a bit more the concept of USOCO, the Office of Contingency Operations, how it would be structured, how it would be staffed, most importantly, how would it be led?
Certainly. First of all, it's embodied in a bill on the Hill now. H.R. 2606. You can find it on Thomas. It spells out in detail the reasons for it and the structure of it. But let me touch on the high points. First of all, the purpose. The purpose would be to ensure responsibility, accountability, and integration in planning, execution, and oversight of stabilization and reconstruction operations. The fact is that today there is no center point. There is no clear answer about who's in charge of these kinds of operations. I know the cigar has recognized this problem. It's a problem that we identified in Iraq, and that's unacceptable given the gravity of the national security interest at play. This was an idea that came out of our first work, Hard Lessons, in 2009, and then developed over time in discussions with Ambassador Crocker, with ambassadors in Iraq, with DOD, with General Odierno, General Petraeus, General Austin, all of whom are favorable towards this idea. Ambassador Jeffrey likes it as well. Ambassador Hill. These are the people who have served in Iraq. And those are the people who I usually hear coming to me saying, this makes sense. I'm glad you're talking about it, because we do need to reform our approach. Functionally, it would report to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, because these are CivMil operations. That's to whom I report. So this is not completely an audit reporting chain. And also, it somewhat echoes what, frankly, the most successful overseas rebuilding office that ever existed did, and that's the ECA, the Economic Command Administration of the Marshall Plan, which reported to Sec State and Sec Commerce. And it would be led by a director and have 2 deputy directors. It would have a policy reporting chain to the National Security Advisor. I think that's an important innovation that came as we discussed this idea across the interagency. We learned a lot over the last 3 years before introducing HR 2606 was introduced from leaders like General Scowcroft, who observed that you need to have that fold into the NSC, but you can't put it in the NSC because that's too close. Putting it in the Executive Office of the President creates political issues. And Len Hawley, who oversaw the rebuilding program in the Balkans, supports this idea, but he similarly agreed you needed to have it outside the NSC. It needs to be standalone, reporting to these 2 secretaries so that you have authority and accountability. Integration is the word I most often use in describing it, rather than coordination. In Iraq, there were thousands and thousands of meetings that were coordinative. But coordination works as long as the parties to the agreement continue and endure in that agreement. And I saw too often in Iraq that not happen. Integration is about preparing for the kinds of operations you're going to undertake in these settings before you begin. To begin to work with the contractors before the operation starts, to have a capacity already in place, a variety of plans, a resilience in place that ensures your ability to change course without losing ground. Eisenhower said, it's the planning that matters, not the plan. And by that he meant the resilience created by going through the planning process gives you a capacity to undertake the inevitable, which is that plan will change. We had a plan, as I said in my remarks, going in, and what we ended up doing was dramatically different. And it's fine to do something dramatically different, but be sure you can do that alternative. And as was seen by some at the time, that course change led to mission loss. And that mission loss led to lives lost and money lost and time lost. And we ended up being there for about 10 years, roughly speaking. This ultimately would operate somewhat like FEMA in the sense that its authority would be kicked off with the President declaring a stabilization operation, and it would conclude with his declaration that the stabilization operation is over. That gives you clarity about the role of the Reconstruction Office. And it gives the president control. It gives him a tool, something tangible, somebody to go to. That doesn't exist. Which agency do you go to? There was a bidding war every year in Iraq each time a supplemental came up, about who was going to control what money. Ultimately, the Department of Defense won those bidding wars. As you heard from Seth, 87% of the money was under DoD contracts, even though state had the policy responsibility. You get that? The dichotomy was stultifying. State is responsible for deciding Reconstruction policy, for defense, which controls the money. Who do you think won those arguments? Yeah, you're right. And it didn't work out so well. General Petraeus' comment was about colossal success in the context of the rebuilding of the Iraqi police force. And the equipping and training of the Army is understandable. But what about electricity and oil and roads and hospitals, education systems? You couldn't put the label colossal success on that, far from it. Why? Because of this disintegration I'm talking about that's missing because of the lack of a functional center, a lack of clarity about who's in charge. USOCO would answer that.
Let me press you just one step further on command and control of such an institution. It is true that you report to the Secretaries of State and Defense, but you were an independent IG. They didn't tell you what to do. So who is it? If this is going to be overseen by two agencies, who is it that's going to give the orders?
We spell out in Chapter 6, first of all, the USOCO director would be driving the office, but how does he get his information is really your point. And USOCO would embed with both DoD and state. The USOCO director would obviously, by law, be under the direction of the chief of mission, but it would be all about USOCO itself anticipating what were the top 5 countries that were going to be possibly engaged with: Syria, Pakistan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia. Those are probably the top 5 right now. So as FEMA anticipates that there might be a hurricane that will hit next year in in Tampa, St. Pete. Sorry, let's get to the coast. Get my geography right. The fact is that that's similarly from a geopolitical sense, you could make similar judgments and make similar sorts of preparations. The USOCO director working with state and defense would be responsible for managing these resources. The answer here, Ryan, is it is no one's primary duty now. The state's primary duty is diplomacy. Defense's primary duty is conflict, kinetic engagement. AIDS is development. And development, diplomacy, and defense all figure into these operations, but they are not dominant. And we've also tried putting it in one agency already. SCRS didn't work. So it has to be pulled out. You can't put it, it might work in defense, but it's not politically tenable. Can't do that because it has to have a civilian face. Aid? No, it can't work unless you completely change the culture of aid, which is largely a contracted out agency at this point. Can't go to Treasury and Justice, obviously. Doesn't have a place. And so that answers the question about should it be within an existing agency. No, pull it out. Who should it report to? State and defense are the ones. But the director, long and detailed answer back to what I said at the outset, is responsible, is accountable, just as the FEMA director is responsible, is accountable for ensuring that adequate planning is done before the disaster or the SRO strikes.
I'm going to ask you one more follow-up because as we look ahead to likely scenarios, I think this is just a critically important issue. This may shock and surprise you, but there actually have been times in our recent modern history when the Secretaries of State and Defense did not exactly see eye to eye.
I recall.
So what happens if the Secretaries of State and Defense do not see eye to eye on how USOCO should proceed?
That's why there's a third reporting chain dotted line policy to the NSA, the National Security Advisor. And I think the policy drive is from the National Security Advisor. Now, this is what Len Hawley and Brent Scowcroft said was key to ensuring that USOCO would work, to have that chain in there. You know, it wasn't in the initial proposal. Those experts who've lived and breathed this kind of operation said you've got to have it, because you've got to have the policy weave in to the White House to ensure that you have that answer. You know, what you're talking about is a policy difference between SecState and SecDef that might alter what the USOCO director was trying to decide to do. Well, that is where formally, whereas it was informal in Iraq and Afghanistan, the National Security Advisor would play a role.
And indeed, that is the way our system is supposed to function. Sometimes it actually does. Could I ask Dr. Savage and Dr. Center to comment briefly on your views of what Seeger has proposed with the creation of USOCO?
Can I just provide one minor historical corrective? I'm not sure that the Marshall Plan is the best example of this. I teach a class at the Foreign Service Institute, and I use a quote from Paul Hoffman, who was the administrator of the Marshall Plan, in which he says, "I don't recall one time consulting with Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, about the administration of the Marshall Plan." Now, that may not literally have been true, but it reflected the fact that creating this separate development agency did not, with dual hats, did not fix the problem of coordination. And then in conjunction with that quote, I have a headline from the New York Times which says, "Coordination seen weak where Defense, State, and ECA, the Marshall Plan, are all in existence in the same country." So what I'm suggesting based on this is the decision to take development outside of the State Department. There was never really a discussion of putting it in a nascent Defense Department at the time. Actually created what would later become USAID, which created the bifurcation between diplomacy and development in the first place, which we've been trying to put back together for the past 40 plus years. Which gets to my follow-up, my real follow-up, which is on the question of process. Tremendous amount of energy has been spent refining the interagency process for stability operations. And this is the most cohesive, coherent approach laid out. And yet, if you look at some of the case studies specifically from Iraq, for instance, one of the great innovations was creating the position of a senior coordinator for anti-corruption, cited in Mr. Bowen's report. And then you turn the page and you learn that roughly $40 billion a year was being laundered out of Iraq every year. And I wonder how we separate innovations in process from fixes in outcome. In other words, more substantively, what are the effective process innovations that we can make in an interagency environment to lead to effects versus process innovations which make tremendous amount of sense from good governance perspective, but which may not lead to actual effects in the field?
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say my Marshall Plan analog was just for the point that dual reporting is not unprecedented. It actually is the only other example I know of in executive branch history where there was an official who reported to two secretaries, other than Seeger and Segar.
Dr. Savage.
The federal government and its entire reconstruction stabilization effort it's so fragmented. The agencies don't talk to each other. Within agencies, they don't talk to each other. When you get down to contractors working on the same contract, they don't talk to each other. You have contractors in Iraq who work on the provincial level, not talking to the contractors who work on the central government level because they have proprietary differences working on the same project, so they don't exchange information. The fragmentation issue is just endemic to these efforts, and trying to find some sort of coordination effort, some sort of locus of decision-making here is to be applauded. The problem here for me is what is the reporting lines, which I think Ambassador Crocker mentioned, but these agencies only work if they have their own budget and they have their own personnel and they're able to move into these areas. And then when you get down to the problem of fragmenting, even within these agencies, where you lose core capacity, an agency like USAID, where they have, in fact, in the case of Iraq, contractors monitoring contractors to determine there was contract compliance is an example of fragmentation even within an agency. If you do not have core capacity within an agency, if you do not have budget control, then you have a systemic failure in these kinds of organizations. I think you can take a look at some other efforts to create coordination, and you can question how they worked out. Homeland Security is one. How do you solve the problem? You try to bring it under one roof. You still have fragmentation issues and coordination problems. And then you have the national intelligence effort to bring in all these different agencies to make them produce some sort of cohesive report to the president and so on, which has its own limitations. So these are systemic problems within bureaucracies, and I would ask Mr. Bowen about what could be done to create an organization that has umbrella responsibilities, that actually has its own personnel beyond what you're talking about, the $25 million, that actually has core capacity within itself and its own budget that it can manage, as opposed to dealing with all these other behemoths in the federal world.
Well, the $25 million is for the functioning of USOCO, but it also has, like FEMA, an operational fund, a contingency fund that it would have, that would give it some capacity, to address your points, to carry out these kinds of operations. I mean, the key responsibility, obviously, before operations begin, is planning, to anticipate, and that's. I guess let's start with the most important premise. The status quo is unacceptable. That there isn't a systemic solution in place now that's going to promote CivMil integration. So if you accept those two premises, status quo is unacceptable, the CivMil integration piece has not been accomplished, then what next? And so USOCO is on the table as a possibility. There really is not an interagency alternative at play. And so it would have capacity. I mean, $25 million is not very much money. That's your I think your implicit point about it. But its capacity doesn't come from its operational capital, but from its contingency fund. The same as FEMA. FEMA has a $2 billion disaster relief fund that drives its contracting, and that, I think that's a big piece we haven't talked about yet, and that's the role of contractors. I mean, the paramount phenomenon, I think, to come out of the Iraq and Afghanistan effort with regard to our national security operations is the role of contractors. Certainly too unregulated from a private security perspective in Iraq early on, and Nusra Square in September 2007 is a tragic example of that. The most flagrant example, but there were others. But ultimately it's about, as FEMA does, working with the contractors before operations begin. So you develop familiarity, you develop capacity, you develop expectations and operating systems that have some uniformity. And instead what we have are whichever agency you're with or has a different set of, or working with, is a different set of procurement rules and IT responsibilities and others that create drag on the operations and limit mission accomplishment.
Okay. I'm going to roll an even bigger question at you. You noted that we shifted early on from a policy of liberate and leave to occupy and rebuild. This, of course, is because the circumstances we encountered in the immediate aftermath of the invasion were not the circumstances we expected. I won't say that we planned for, because we didn't plan. I would just say this illustrates Crocker's first theorem of the Middle East, which is be careful what you get into. So here's the big question for the three of you. Should we be doing state building and reconstruction at all?
I call that.
Go ahead.
No, I call that the law of the universe question. The bureaucrats are concerned with tactical lessons learned, so that's my punt on that. There's only about a dozen people at any given time in the United States government who can make the decision about whether the United States as a country will engage systematically in the way that we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the rest of us, our job is to posture, prepare, train, to enact the policy. And I think what Mr. Bowen's proposal is simply to accept that decision that the 12 people at the highest levels will make will be made one way or the other. And historically, it suggests no matter how many times we've thought we should not do this again, we will do it again. And so at the tactical level, we should be prepared with the operational lessons. That's a punt on that.
It is a punt,
Yeah.
Seth, yes.
Well, and I'll catch the punt and run it back. The reality is this proposal is driven by what history dictates. We have. The answer to that question is yes, we have since 1980 engaged in these kinds of operations. Okay, so we may go into a period of neo-isolationism and decide not to. That would be the rejoinder to your point, to the answer no. But that's not what history has been teaching in the 21st century and the late 20th century. But regardless, I think whether we do it is really the question, not should we at all, is a case-by-case basis. I think if we do it, it should always be multilateral. And if it's going to be multilateral, we ought to have a capacity, a center point, to which other nations can reach to begin to engage in the kind of planning necessary for success. And other nations are doing work in this area more than we are. The stabilization unit in the UK is smaller, but more integrated than anything we have ongoing now. Australia has a similar office. Canada, the start. Denmark even is working on offices that integrate civilian and military capacities to execute stabilization operations, not because they want a state build, but because they've recognized the way of the world and that they may be called upon to engage in stabilization and reconstruction operations. And it's all about how you respond to a state that moves from fragility to failure. And can the answer be we're never going to respond? No, I don't think that can be the answer. Therefore, that's the long answer to the question. Yes, we're going to respond. History dictates it, and I think also rational, moral, geopolitical policy dictates it as well. How we respond will be a case-by-case basis. Whether we respond will be a case-by-case basis. Will we respond again? Yes.
Thank you very much. To give some solace to the historians in the room, I would note that we did take history into account in some of the decision-making early on in Iraq. For example, the status of the Iraqi army. As Stuart points out, the president's initial position was we would leave the army intact and use it as an instrument for whatever rebuilding needed to be done. That's what the British did at the conclusion of World War I when they engineered the Iraqi mandate for themselves. They basically followed President Bush's Plan A. They left the Ottoman structures intact, including the army, which was, as was the case under Saddam, all Sunni Muslim dominated. What happened? the Grand Ayatollah of the day called for a Shia revolt. And the British spent the next 10 painful years putting down that Shia revolt. I would suggest to you, and again, we will never know, had we kept Saddam's army in place, we would have had another Shia revolt called for by Grand Ayatollah Sistani. We came awfully close to it anyway with Muqtada al-Sadr, particularly in 2004. So, you know, where we made the mistake, I don't think was in disbanding the army. It was not moving swiftly enough to pay pensions and to begin the process of reconstituting an army that would include vetted members of the old army. But history is made up of things that didn't happen as well as those that did. And it's just worth spending a moment on that. Once again, it's Veterans Day. We thank and express our gratitude to our veterans who are here among us, and we remember those who didn't live to be veterans. And I'd just like to remark on this occasion that we lost staff at both our embassies in Baghdad and Kabul, in Iraq and Afghanistan, including the head of our reconstruction division in the embassy, who was killed by an improvised explosive device as he was making his umpteenth trip out to Fallujah to try to salvage that wastewater treatment plant. Stewart lost one of his inspectors. There is a price to be paid for going forth into these difficult places. And in that vein, I would just like to ask Ambassadors Rafel and Ariano, who were out there in the smoke and the dust in Iraq, trying to get things right, trying to keep them from going even more wrong. If you have any comments on the this whole process of stabilization and reconstruction from a practitioner's perspective.
Okay. Well, I just hate to put my back to people, so I'll turn around. I'd just like to make 2 points because I guess one comes away from these places very humbled by the complexity, and especially humbled by the question of whether there is a structure that will really ensure integration and coordination, and what if that breaks down. We have spent a lot of time trying to get it right. I think one of the things, and I'd like to refer to Iraq first because we'll talk about Afghanistan afterward. One of the things that I found was that as situations changed, what you really needed was the tightest, most streamlined coordination among everybody who was working in a given area. As Ambassador Crocker knows, by the time I got there, which was in 2006, we had made a decision that there were areas of the country, including Fallujah and Ramadi, Anbar province, where you simply could not work any longer. So one of my first acts going in as USAID director was to suspend all activity and pull all of our staff back to Kabul. General Allen, who was the deputy commander in Anbar at that time, agreed with me. And basically, we held meetings at the highest levels with officials to indicate why we were doing this. That goes to the question of, do you do state building or don't you do state building? And I don't think it's only because I am a USAID employee, but I do feel very, very strongly that there is another side to conflict and stabilization, which has to be trying to demonstrate what the potential is that is not just militarily driven. And if we're not in there, we and other donors, if we're not in there showing that, even in the most difficult places, there really is never that light at the end of the tunnel for people to see. So I do feel that this really does, no matter how, you tactically you decide when you stop, when you start. But I do think that example needs to be there. In terms of coordination and the proposal on the table for a different kind of entity, I am still a bit skeptical, having been through the need for agile decision-making, and I'm not convinced entirely that what you're describing is going to provide that kind of agility, that kind of rapid, reaction and turning the corner that one needs in situations like this. I'd like to hear your comments on that myself, Stuart.
Well, I guess is the status quo acceptable? Is my first response, and I think not. And ultimately, I think USOCO would provide agility, stood up and integrated, whereas mission stovepiped was just a burden in Iraq, as we know, and the failure to ensure effective, enduring coordination, which I would call integration, held us back. I would hope properly structured, properly resourced, properly trained, properly integrated, USOCO could solve some of that.
Ambassador Rayfield.
Yes, just a couple of comments here. I'd like to pick up on the point that Dr. Center made about the diplomacy of reconstruction and the significance of that, or the significance of diplomacy in conflict areas, something that Ambassador Crocker is our prize practitioner of. Others of us tried in our own way to emulate and do it in our own way. But I recall very distinctly when I was asked if I would go out to be a member of the first Iraq team of civilians that went with General Garner in April of 2003. And I'd been to Iraq, but I had not served there. I mean, I'd visited in several contexts, but it wasn't a country I knew particularly well. But to my mind, I had to go, and the main reason I had to go is that I knew it would be chaotic. I knew there were many assumptions that the Iraqi citizenry would make about why we were there, after their oil revenues and so on and so forth. And that after 30-odd years in this business, the least I could do would be to go and do my bit to try and explain our broader reasoning for coming to Iraq, what we were trying to accomplish, American solidarity with the citizens of Iraq who had suffered under the Saddam Hussein regime, and so on. So I think there is a significance to that, and it's important in the capital, but it's also important around the country, in various provincial cities and so on, so that people can see the face of America and have a better understanding of our goals. Secondly, the whole enterprise of reconstruction and state building, as everyone here has remarked, is very complex. And I think the fact is it's very, very difficult and challenging, even for a country as large and with as large a diplomatic establishment as the United States, to be able to field the kind of people who can really do the necessary listening and get the necessary buy-in in a very broad-based way. If we had 5,000 Ryan Crockers with language skills and a sense of history and the culture of the region, we might be able to do it. But I think we need to be modest about how much influence we think we can project, either through the agencies and our diplomatic corps, USAID, and everyone who's been involved in this, even with the best coordination and the best integration, because it takes, a skill set and a depth that's almost colonial in nature, and we don't have that, and I'm not sure we really want to go down that road. So I'm not sure what I conclude from that, but those are observations that I have. Thank you.
We're going to go to Q&A from the room, and I just am going to do the pointing and the calling on folks. So if you have a question in mind, raise your hand. I'm just going to take, of course, as I often do, the prerogative of having the microphone. I want to just make one comment and ask a question, kick things off. What I'm hearing you say in our conversations and what I'm learning, tell me if I'm right or wrong, is a little bit discouraging. Maybe a lot discouraging. After 10 years of enormous expenditure of blood and treasure, we still don't have a very good or even existent structure for dealing with Reconstruction, especially Reconstruction in a war zone. We just still don't have that structure, despite a decade's worth of extraordinary effort. What I'm hearing is that government institutions don't learn very well from experience, or really from each other. I don't know that I'm hearing that USAID was learning from DOD, was learning from the State Department, and that the Iraq teams were learning from the Afghan teams and so on. And I guess my third conclusion that I hear is that we don't do strategic planning very well. Eisenhower has been invoked about planning, but are we really doing strategic planning very well? It sounds like we're waiting for crises to happen and then we respond. Mr. Bowen's report has used the wonderful term adhocracy. That's what we've come down to, and that's going to be I think one of the great takeaways. Adhocracy describes how we handled Iraq. My question to you is, why are these? What are the obstacles to this kind of learning, this kind of strategic thinking? What are the obstacles to putting in place these structures? That, I think, is what the question the historian is going to want to know. We recognize the problem. What are the consistent obstacles? What's standing in our way? Is it bureaucracies are just big, people change, people move on? Or is it political? Is there a political dimension to this? Nobody wants to be planning for the next reconstruction effort because that suggests we're about to invade X or Y and to undertake it. Is it learning? Are we just not training people very well to do this kind of thinking? And is there some kind of training regimen we should be going through? Is it simply that no one has time to think ahead because the crises of the moment are so incredibly complicated? Throw that out to the team.
All of the above. I think very astute. No, and I'll take each one in turn. I think institutional bureaucracies are just generally resistant to change, and this is a significant one in many respects. You just have to look at the story of SCRS, the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization at State. Did it succeed? No. I think there are questions of, how the government responded in the last few years to the challenges in Iraq were, the phrases that were used were first, the whole of government approach. That was the phrase, and it doesn't really mean anything. It just says everybody is going to work together and to resolve these issues. But that's what we had all along for the most part, and there was something called the Interagency Management System within the National Security Council that was supposed to be the implementer of the whole of government approach, and it didn't really work. It didn't really meet. It became an adjudicatory body for disputes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then after that became, we don't want to really learn our lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan because those were awful experiences. And therefore, drawing lessons from them is a bad idea. And I appreciate that. Yeah, they were very difficult and painful, but I think one of the reasons they were difficult and painful is because we weren't well structured to manage them and carry them out. So it's a chicken and egg thing there on that point. I think ultimately we ought to not just look at Iraq and Afghanistan, but we ought to look at our national security experiences in stabilization and reconstruction operations since 1980, which include the Balkans, which was a fairly substantial operation. In PDD 56, managed by Len Hawley from the NSC, embodies somewhat, is sort of the godfather of USOCO. It didn't have the systems and structure, but the idea is quite similar. And he's strongly in favor of this particular reform because, as I've said in previous reports, this is a Goldwater-Nichols moment for the interagency. Goldwater-Nichols in 1986 forced integration upon the military departments. This Goldwater-Nichols moment for the interagency regarding these specific operations could force integration upon the departments charged with varying roles in stabilization and reconstruction operations.
I could make one comment on this. I would argue that structurally, the United States government has not changed very much from the Cold War years. The world has changed enormously. So we're using a Cold War governmental structure to try to deal with the incredibly complex contingencies of a non-polar world. And it isn't working very well. Stuart cited Goldwater-Nichols. Well, another piece of legislation that's worth contemplating in this context, I think, is the National Security Act of 1954, which the administration resisted. They didn't want a National Security Council. They didn't want a Joint Chiefs of Staff. What was wrong with the mechanism we used to fight World War II? Well, because it wasn't World War II anymore. It was a Cold War. So in each of these two cases, it was Congress that effectively forced the executive into a new way of doing business. And you and I and others, having worked with zero success through a couple of administrations to try to get the executive branch to take the lead, as you've heard, there is now legislation pending on the Hill. Whether this Congress is capable of
Fair question.
passing that or anything else remains to be seen. But I would put this initiative in that category of congressionally forced executive branch changes.
Absolutely, and I think another lesson from Iraq, as Ryan just said, is that you can't fix these problems through presidential orders. PDD 56 went away in January of 2001. NSPD 44, such as it was in existence still, went away in January of 2009. They don't endure. Enduring change has to come through legislation.
Well, I'd like to try to invite some of our audience members in the lavender shirt over on the, yeah.
First of all,
hang on for the mic.
First of all, it's truly an honor and a pleasure to hear from such a remarkable body of experience, as well as to hear from you again, Mr. Crocker. My question would be, when we pursue state building, whether we ought to be or not, are we looking to establish the American brand of democracy or merely democracy? And if it is the latter, what set of criteria qualifies a state as sufficiently democratic?
If there's anything I think we've learned from Iraq or Afghanistan is that democracy is really, really hard, and you can't import it. It doesn't come in a box. You can't get it from Amazon. Societies have to develop it by themselves in a manner that suits their history, traditions, and culture. Yes, the United States and other international partners can give some advice along the way, but to try and create many little Americas out there absolutely, positively, categorically will not work. Did I leave any ambiguity there?
He's absolutely right.
Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Richard First of all, I just want to make a comment. Thank you, Ryan Crocker and Will and everybody else here for acknowledging that today is Veterans Day and acknowledging the service of people who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan and those, as Ryan Crocker said, that never had the chance to be veterans. I'm sure many of you here know personally military soldiers and sailors who never made it back from those countries or their families. It's heartbreaking and a hurt that those families and friends will never go away. That said, I need to ask the question about possibly another lesson learned from Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is possibly maybe a more important lesson, which a number of you here have already heard about, and that is whether we should have ever been there in the first place. And I'm going to refer to the well-known speech that Secretary of Defense Robert Gates made at West Point in February of 2011, in which he said, and I'm going to quote, because I know many of you have heard this many, many times. Secretary Gates said, "In my opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined," as General MacArthur so delicately put it. Comments?
Well, that settles that. Let's see, I saw, is it Mel, is that you? Yes, I'd like to get Professor Leffler in the back corner.
I very much enjoyed what you said about process. I'm a little surprised that you've talked rather little about substance, meaning what does state building, reconstruction, and stabilization really mean? What have you learned about the essence of those things and the priorities amongst them? Stabilization, reconstruction, nation building are all different things. Have we learned something about the priorities amongst those three, or the interrelationships? Or when you talk about extensive planning, let's say for those 5 countries, do we take each one individually in planning agencies and talk about the respective importance of each of those things, stabilization, reconstruction, nation building, in each of those countries, and the peculiar interrelationships of those things to one another in those countries? I invite your comments. Thank you.
Excellent question. And yes, substantively, ensuring that you tackle the big things and most important things first is crucial to a successful planning and planning process. And that begins, the lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan is rule of law. It was not effectively tackled early on. It is certainly been the paramount challenge in both places, and developing systems and capacities to address that on a country-by-country basis, on a case-by-case basis, which is what the planning should be all about. And we have collected that kind of information, for example, with regard to Syria or Yemen, but no one is using it for planning how it might be addressed should a stabilization and reconstruction operation need to ensue, which is the point at which a fragile state moves to failure. Now, you're right, stabilization is about moving the country away from a kinetic setting and towards sovereignty and towards functioning government systems, right? And then reconstruction is just what it is. You know, it's beginning to invest in the systems within the society, both hard and soft. You know, the electricity and the roads and bridges and healthcare and education, but also governance capacity. And particularly local governance capacity as well. But those follow on, I believe, the most important foundation stone for a successful stabilization and reconstruction operation, and that is rule of law.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's 3 o'clock, and I promised that we would go until 3. I think if it's all right with the panel, could I take one more, or should we stop? Yeah, let's take one more. The gentleman in the necktie, I know, has his hand up from the very moment. Yeah, and this will be our last one. Then we'll take a brief break, and we'll reconvene in just about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I certainly have no doubt that having an efficient process and a coordinated operation is essential to any kind of rebuilding. But it strikes me that what we haven't discussed and what was a glaring problem, at least from my standpoint, was that we didn't have a sufficient understanding of the cultural situation we were dealing with, and that the tensions that existed religiously and ethnically were virtually insurmountable, at least in terms of our ability to deal with them. Am I missing something?
Well, as someone who spent his career in the area, that was kind of my point. We really don't know what we're getting into, but I can tell you it isn't going to be good. I talked earlier about the British experience. You know, we managed to avoid a Shia revolt. We got a Sunni revolt. And, you know, there was no way. I could tell that, you know, I got there in April. I could tell from the get-go there is no way you could make the three major communities, on the sectarian level, the Shia and the Sunni, on the ethnic level, the Kurds, you were not going to align all three. The best you could get was going to be 2 out of 3. The Kurds were a given, not quite. I think if we had kept Saddam's army, we would have had trouble with the Kurds too, not on quite the same scale we would have with the Shia. But the Shia being the majority, you know, that was sort of the Hobson's choice. You know, should we have foreseen it? Yes. But there was a determination that we were going to depose a dictator and create a new democratic Iraq in the center of the Middle East. You know, I've had a lot of sleepless nights in my life. The worst ones were the run-up to the war. As Ambassador Rafel knows, you know, the supreme irony is, having said, please don't do this, they did it, and then said, Crocker, get out there. And I went.
Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a brief break. We're going to do the same with Afghanistan in about 10 minutes. Thank you.